the questions come up as to why do certain learning experiences tend to stick better than other learning experiences. That's a concept that a lot of the business books, business libraries, etc., have been asking this question of stickiness. What brings about stickiness? Why does one set of storytelling stick? Why do things stick in people's minds and other things just slip out? What causes something to really bind and become part of consciousness, and other things are simply observed and taken on and then drift off in one ear and out the other, so to speak? So the story I will tell you, as far as I know, is true, although I was not there in person, so I cannot attest to this from personal experience, but the people who told me, several people told me this, so I believe it's the honest truth. In 1983, I think, when I was doing my practitioner training, at the end of that training, a number of us were very interested in taking NLP further, and John Grinder had come to Philadelphia, and he did a several-day training there in Philadelphia, which very much convinced me that I wanted to follow up and study Grinder's approach. That seemed to be, to me, the approach that really contained, at that time, where my mind was at that time, contained the deepest, most vital kernel of NLP for my own uses. But I was approached by other members of our little NLP community in New York City at the time, and they said they'd just heard about this guy Tony Robbins. No one had ever heard of Tony Robbins before. This was the very earliest days, the very beginning of Tony. And so I went over to Santa Cruz to study John's approach in Santa Cruz, and I think they went to Phoenix, Arizona. I believe that's where this took place. And they did their training with Tony, but Tony had a very interesting twist, I think, and this was the difference that made the difference as far as really installing NLP into your permanent repertoire. At the end of the training, in those days, what Tony did was he had you turn in your keys, your wallet, all your money, all your identification. So basically, you were completely anonymous. You had no identification, no money, nothing. And of course, no one even had cell phones back then. They may have been in some very, very early stage of development, but there was no such thing as a cell phone or a GPS or any of those devices we take for granted at the moment. No internet. I think fax machines were just starting to appear. That was about where the technology was. So what Tony did to all the members of his practitioner training who wished to be certified by Tony is he took away all their money and all their identification. All they had was their clothes on their back, and I think they were allowed a windbreaker. And they were turned loose on the streets of Phoenix, Arizona, and they had to find some way to get to Los Angeles, California, and meet at a specific restaurant. It was like a Denny's diner type restaurant at a given time, a given location, and all meet there. And so they were supposed to somehow get themselves from Phoenix to Los Angeles by any means they could, which generally meant hitchhiking with truckers. This is something that's just inconceivable today. No one would permit it. It would be impossible for a number of reasons. But back then, that was actually standard procedure. That's the way people were tested. All right. So run this through your thinking a little bit. How would you approach your NLP training? What sorts of engagement would you bring to it? How seriously would you take it? How many parts of your mind and how many different aspects of yourself and deeper, more hidden parts of yourself would be fully incorporated and fully engaged in every level, and the seriousness you would take it, the full learning process, if you knew that the way you would be tested is you would be asked to, using all of your skill sets and all of your orienting skills and rapport skills, congruence detection, etc., safely get yourself from Phoenix to Los Angeles. So I don't know how long that is in miles, 800 miles or something. It's a pretty good drive there. And that's what his early classes did. And those people, I guarantee you, had a very, very different approach leading up to their certification test. Imagine if you knew that's how you would be tested. Your entire attitude toward the classwork, your exercises, the readings, the kind of attention and focus would be an entirely different thing. Entirely different. I don't think there's anything in a modern training that can possibly replicate that. So there you have an idea of how an outcome or an endpoint, as opposed to an intention, can make a very profound, significant difference in the way you approach what you're doing. It's saying, okay, if you know you've got to pass through certain types of goal structures or consequence structures to really truly reach where you're headed, you're going to go back and you're going to build a very potent internal representation of how that training is going to work for you. So that's how that worked. And I suppose those are the sorts of consequence differences. At the consequence side of Diltz's intention through complex equivalence to consequence, when you get those sorts of potential consequences, very much like military training where people are trained with live ammunition. Sometimes they're trained with blanks to get used to being around firing guns, but at another level of their training, they've actually got to crawl under a carpet of live ammunition, machine guns firing over them. And if they inadvertently stick any body part up, it will get shot off. So that gives you an entirely different framework. Your attitude, your states. Imagine the state difference in your learning. All right? From saying at the end of the training, we'll just have a verbal test and people will test us by observation, then we'll get our certificate, versus, yes, you've got to do all that, and then you've got to be able to hitchhike 800 miles with nothing other than your mental resources to get you there. So that may explain why there are significantly different outcomes for different people in different trainings.